get started, good evening, everyone. We're very glad you're here. My name is Shane Larson. I'm the Associate Director of Sierra, which is the Center for Interdisciplinary Exploration and Research in Astrophysics. So it's kind of like SHIELD. We got a really hard name, so we just have a short name you can call us, right? So we are the interdisciplinary center on campus here at Northwestern for astronomy. We do astronomy research, we do astronomy education, we do astronomy outreach from a variety of disciplines, people who do physics, people who do astronomy, people who do engineering, people who do computers, from all over campus and all disciplines. If they work on something that intersects with astronomy, then we collaborate together and we do awesome things. And so part of our education and outreach mission is to provide opportunities for those of you who don't do astronomy every day in your lives to join us and learn a little bit about the universe, have an opportunity to hear what we do here at Northwestern, have an opportunity to get questions you may have answered. So we do a variety of monthly events, which you can see on our website if you saw the sites there on the slides before. But twice a year we do a big public event. So this is one of them in the spring. The other one we will do in October around homecoming. So watch for that opportunity. Okay? During the spring, we always like to highlight one of our colleagues from here at Northwestern. So tonight it is my great pleasure to introduce my colleague, Dr. Allison Strom. So Allison, yeah, that's right. That's what she needs. So Allison is one of our new professors here at Northwestern. She just joined us this year. She did her undergraduate work at the University of Arizona. Yes, University of Arizona. I always forget which one. University of Arizona. She did MPhil at Cambridge and then did her PhD at Caltech. She was a Carnegie Princeton postdoc for many, many years before she accepted our position and joined us here at Northwestern. She uses the largest telescopes in the world, and she will tell you about some of them, to study the nature and lifetimes of galaxies, particularly teenager galaxies. Okay? So the only thing I will encourage, those of you who are back of the room kids, I see a lot of you up there. All of us professors know exactly who you are. The lights may disrupt your opportunity to see the spectral signatures when we get to that part of the talk. So if you want to move forward, now's the time. But otherwise, you may have to look afterwards if you can't see quite so well. Okay? So with no further ado, I will hand it over to Dr. Strom. Oh, I should. Afterwards, we will have a survey about the event. For those of you who fill out the survey, there is a door prize, which is a visualization of a black hole destroying another astrophysical object. Okay, so this is the raffle for those of you who fill out the surveys. So please do avail yourself of the opportunity. Okay, this will be the talking point at your next barbecue, I guarantee you. Okay, Allison, it's all yours.
All right. Thank you, Shane. And thank all of you for coming and spending your Friday night with us at Sierra. As you saw, there are a number of activities and things to do outside. So after the talk, I hope you will take a time to stop by a number of those booths. And if you want, visit Dearborn Observatory at 9. I think it opens at 9. Okay, perfect. All right. So I was very excited when they invited me to talk about my research at this lecture, because this has really been the year of the James Webb Space Telescope. We are actually coming up on the first year, the end of the first year of operations, and there's so much exciting science. It's really, you know, the phrase drinking from a fire hose doesn't even begin to describe how a lot of us feel every day. But I actually want to start a little bit further back. In the mid-1990s, is actually the first time that we were reliably able to find galaxies in the distant universe. And at that time, we were restricted to mostly studying them with telescopes on the ground. And of course, you must all be familiar with the Hubble Space Telescope, which revolutionized the way that we looked at the distant universe. And the Hubble Deep Fields, these here in the middle, were actually what sowed the seed that made the Webb Space Telescope possible. So Hubble himself said that the history of astronomy is the history of receding horizons. And as you can see, Webb is really pushing us out almost to the beginning of the universe. So I actually want to start by showing you the mission trailer, because I think it really captures the spirit of discovery that we all felt as we were anticipating the launch and commissioning of this telescope, and now as we feel using the data from the first year.
We have uncovered wonders undreamt by our ancestors who first speculated on the nature of those wandering lights in the night sky. We've crossed the solar system and sent ships to the stars. But we continue to search. We can't help it. A central element of the human future lies far beyond the Earth. If we crave some cosmic purpose, then let us find ourselves a worthy goal.
Every time I watch this, I get chills. Oh, I'm supposed to talk louder because the microphone is not working very well. Can you hear me in the back if I project a little bit more? Okay, perfect. All right. So the lecture today is actually, I want to tell you two stories. I want to tell you the story of JWST and how my group is using it to study galaxies in the distant universe. But I also want to tell you the story of us, where the Milky Way came from, how it ended up the way that it did, because this is part of all of our origin story. And in fact, one of the really wonderful things about astronomy is in some ways the newest science, the youngest science, but it is also the oldest science. From the time that people could look up at the sky, we've wondered about the origin of the stars, of the Milky Way, and I'm sure, how many of you have actually had the opportunity to be in a dark place where you've seen the Milky Way? Ah, wonderful. I used to ask this question in LA, and people would look at me like I was a little bit crazy, so this is much better. Anyway, what are some questions people had about the Milky Way when they saw it for the first time? Okay. Anything else? How far is it? Yeah. Perfect. And so a lot of these go towards the question of how it, how did it get there, right? And what is it made of? And these are questions that people all over the world have asked. And indeed, I want to share one story from the Ojibwe, who imagined that the Milky Way was the river of souls, or the spirit path, that the souls would progress after passing along along the Milky Way into some afterlife. But actually, if you go and you look at the dictionary definition of galaxy says any of the very large groups of stars and associated matter that are found throughout the universe. Wonderful. I think that we would all agree with that definition. But in fact, for most of human history, galaxy, that word galaxy, only referred to our own galaxy, to the Milky Way. And it wasn't until 100 years ago that actually changed. And it had to do with this object right here. Does anyone know what that is? Wonderful. See, you guys are already experts, so you should be giving the talk. All right. So what happened 100 years ago is this man, Edwin Hubble, who was a staff scientist at Carnegie Observatories in Pasadena, was building on the work of a woman named Henrietta Swan Leavitt. And he was looking for what we call recurrent novae in this spiral nebula of M31. He was looking for stars that would get bright and fade, get bright again. And you'll see he's marked some of these N because he was looking for novae, N for novae. But you'll also notice that there's one up here that he crossed out and he wrote in capital letters in red, VAR. And that's because, sorry, actually I messed up. Nobody go bright and then disappear. VAR, these are the ones that get bright and get dim and then come back. So this was the first time he'd observed a star that didn't get bright and disappear, but came back again. And this is called a Cepheid variable. And based off of the work of Henrietta Swan Leavitt, you can use it to find the distance to that star. And so he was able to calculate more reliably than ever before the distance to Andromeda. And it was so far away that it could not possibly be in the Milky Way. And this was the dawn of the era of extragalactic, outside of the galaxy astronomy. So this is the dawn of my kind of astronomy, so I'm very indebted to Dr. Hubble. All right, so today we observe galaxies in significantly more detail than Hubble was capable of. And so you can see now when we look at Andromeda, when we look at Andromeda, we see dust lanes, we see bright patches of stellar nurseries, we see the older stars in the center of the galaxy. And this allows us to begin to understand perhaps where it came from, what it's doing now, and in some ways we use it as an analog for our own galaxy, which is hard to study, the idea of the forest for the trees. The natural sort of extension of that is looking for galaxies even further away. And this should be a familiar picture to you because this was the very first image that was shown from the James Webb Space Telescope. President Biden announced it in mid-July of last year. And you can see that in these galaxies, we're also seeing a lot of detail. You can see these little dots here. These are globular clusters in this very distant galaxy. You can see the sort of a yellowish ball that looks like the center of Andromeda. And even in some, you can see dust lanes and spiral arms. But the thing about these galaxies, these are 10 billion light years away. Some of the tiny red ones are 13 billion years away, or 13 billion light years ago. We're seeing them as they were 13 billion years ago. And I sometimes wonder what Hubble would think if he was confronted with this picture. Because when we, as an astronomy community, saw this, we were already overwhelmed. But can you imagine if you had never before thought about such a diversity of galaxies and you wanted to understand how this could possibly occur? And I feel like a question that I would have is, where do you even begin to answer that kind of question? How do you begin to pick apart all of the complexity that you see in this population? So I'd like to go on a little thought experiment, and I would like you to imagine that you are an alien, and you have come to visit planet Earth, and you are observing the vast diversity of humankind. You can't do anything but watch us. You can't talk to us. You can't take samples. You can only watch us. How might you start off trying to understand humans? Yeah. Seeing how they function. Other ideas? Yeah. Size? Yes. So I'm hearing examples of categorization. You're going to begin sorting people. You might say, okay, we're interested in whether or not they have long hair or short hair, dark hair or light hair, glasses, sunglasses, no glasses, and size. You might be interested in their height. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's sort all humans by their height. We'll put the small people in one bin and the tall people in another bin and the intermediate-sized people in another bin. And then the next step is trying to understand how those groups are connected to one another. That's how you build up a theory of human development. And so, I don't know, it feels reasonable that you could start off with a lot of stuff, and as you grow and live, you would use up that stuff and become small. You laugh because you have prior knowledge that that is not the case. right? Instead, we know that we start off as babies. We take a sometimes winding path through childhood all the way to adulthood. But this theory that age can be measured by looking at height can sometimes break down. So this is a picture of me and another human on the day that I was awarded my PhD. And how many of you think that she is younger than me? So this is my grandmother, who I was very pleased could be there on that day. But you'll see that this one-to-one sort of correlation that shorter people are younger people is not always correct. And that's because there is an inherent diversity in the human population. So if you look at the CDC data for the heights of women as a function of age, you see that there are enough sort of spread that you could get the case that we see here, where my grandmother, who is much more older and wiser than I am, is also still shorter. So what does this look like when we think about trying to understand galaxies? So this is another lovely image from the SEERS team. This was one of the sort of first teams that had volunteered essentially to do a lot of public work that would become immediately available. And they have assembled these beautiful mosaics that you can go and find online. But some categories that astronomers have tried when sorting galaxies are to do size, the same way that we did with humans, or maybe color, right? You see red galaxies and blue galaxies. Maybe shape. So there are some disturbed galaxies. There are some very regular galaxies, sort of ones that are just sort of blobby, or spiral arms. So this is a step beyond shape to sort of complexity. And this is actually what people did. This is actually what Hubble did. He was very busy in the 1920s. And he sorted galaxies into things that he called early type, so these smooth, sort of football-shaped galaxies, and late type, which were branched out. So these are the ones that have spiral arms, or they have a little bar that then begins spiral arms. And based off this terminology, you might imagine that this is actually telling you that we're looking at young galaxies and older galaxies. But in fact, if you look at the paper that he wrote about this study, he says, the nomenclature it is emphasized refers to the position in the sequence, and temporal connections are made at one's peril. The entire classification is purely empirical and without prejudice to theories of evolution. So he put this label on things and then said, well, but maybe don't interpret it the way that you will naturally interpret it. And actually, if you go to galaxy conferences today, we know that these are the older galaxies and these are the younger galaxies, but we still refer to these as early type and these as late type. Very hard to teach old dogs new tricks, maybe. Okay, so let's go back and think about what else we might need to do then in order to understand and fit categories or sort of put categories of galaxies sort of in a sequence that tells us something about their growth and evolution. We can go back to this idea of this analogy with humans, and we want to understand the development of humans. And this is me with my other grandmother. And the reason why I'd like to highlight her is because she's a very dedicated amateur genealogist. She knows a lot about the history of our family. And I can ask her all sorts of questions about her childhood or her parents or the generations that came over from England. But if we actually wanted to connect our progenitor, her mother, with us, the descendants, and we didn't have the privilege of asking questions, what could we do instead? How can you connect people and know that they're related? Sure. DNA. Exactly. So if you took DNA from all three of us, you would see that there are similar trends. And so even though we can't interview galaxies, we can test their DNA. And that's what I'm going to show you that we're doing with JWST. Okay, so the tool that we use to test galaxies' DNA is something called spectroscopy, which is simply looking, instead of at a flat image, like you can see here, you look at different colors of light. And that's going to tell you about different parts of the object, the composition of the object, maybe the age of the object. And this quote actually comes from the advisor of a friend of mine when we were undergraduate research and interns. And I heard her just, she was really stuck on a problem, and her advisor came, and they were talking about it, and her advisor, she got really kind of like, that very excited, and you can hear it even if they're whispering. And she says, if a picture is worth 1,000 words and a spectrum is worth 1,000 pictures, that means it's worth 1,000,000 words. And I just remember laughing because it sounds so absurd, but it's really true. Spectroscopy is the way that modern astrophysicists learn about the universe. Okay, so this is the general idea. You have white light, and you can disperse it into its constituent colors using some kind of disperser, either a grating or a prism in this case, and you end up having colors separated by their wavelength, is how we refer to the color of light. And so on one end, you have infrared light, and in fact, if you disperse light, you'll also see, if you put a thermometer past the end of the infrared or the red light, you would see it begin to heat up. Actually, this was a classic experiment. And then on the other end, we have ultraviolet light, light that we can't see, but for example, bees can see. And so it's really our eyes that limit us to the visible wavelengths. And now is the time when all of you, I'm going to train you to be spectroscopists. So please put on your glasses. Does everyone have glasses? I have some up here. Does everyone good? Okay. Does everyone have them on? What does it look like when you look at this light? A rainbow, right? You should see color sort of across all of those different colors. And maybe it looks something like this. All right. Before I move on, I want to make sure everyone is situated. Everyone who wants glasses has glasses? Okay, so now we're going to look at something else. We're not going to look at my camera. We're going to look at this little light box here. What does this look like? So I'll do this with you. All right. So what I want you to do is look out to the edge of your vision. Do you see the different lines? And you see how there's space between the lines this time? So what we're looking at here is the effect of quantum mechanics. So this is a neon gas, and what you're seeing are all of the different electronic transitions, just when electrons move between atomic levels. But when you blend them all together, when you're not spreading them out, it looks red. So this is why neon lights are red. So we start with a red light, but then if we spread it out, we see all of these colors as a function of wavelength. Okay. So now let's do another one. What does this one look like? Does this have the same pattern? Do you think this is made of neon? Very good. So now we're looking at helium gas. And helium gas has a different pattern of lines that when you combine them together, instead looks pink. And it's getting angry, so I'm going to turn it off. Okay. So one more. And this one is always the most challenging. So I want you to take your time and look for the lines. Okay. So this gas has lines that are very far to the side. So Shane pointed out, this is wonderful advice, if you don't look straight at the light, you'll find the lines in the middle of your vision. So if you look a little to the side, you should see all of the handful of lines that are present. You see them? Which is the brightest line? Very good. So this gas is hydrogen, the most abundant element in the universe. And it has a spectrum that looks like this, where the brightest line is the red line. Now, astronomers, we don't just look at spectra this way because we need something that we can record and compare. And so instead, we look at what we call a spectrum, right? So we record the amount of light at every wavelength, and this is what we can share with other astronomers, and this is what we can analyze. Okay, so keep that red line in mind. But these elements, of course, are not the only elements, right? You see over here the periodic table. And every element in the periodic table has its own unique fingerprint, its own unique DNA sequence. And so if we go and we look at some object that we don't know what it's made of, but we can identify these patterns, we can say, there's oxygen in that, or there's nitrogen in that, or there's a lot of hydrogen in that, which is often the case. All right, but why do we care? How is this actually telling us? Question? Yeah, so some of these lines some of these elements are not actually encountered. They're theoretical. We can't look. So I think these are all actually recorded in a lab by field tested. And so if you can't encounter the gas, then you can't make a measurement. Okay. So the reason why we care about identifying the presence of these elements is that they all come from a different kind of star. And different stars have different lifetimes. And so if you see the material from one kind of star that lives only for a short amount of time, you say, well, okay, that lets us clock that. But if you see material from a kind of star that takes a really long time to make it, that means that you're looking at a longer time. So looking at these elements is a kind of cosmic clock. It's a way of age dating galaxies. And so the material or the stars and the elements that come most quickly are the ones in green, and the ones that come longer are most of the other colors. Okay, so we don't have these kinds of tubes out in the universe, unfortunately, but we do have basically the same thing. And so this is an image of a nearby stellar nursery that was taken by Webb. It was one of the first images released. And instead of a light bulb, we have these massive stars that are so hot, and they're shining on all of this gas and causing it to glow. And so basically, we can look for the same pattern of lines in this hot, glowing gas. So here's an example of how we do it in Andromeda. So these red blobs are red because they have a lot of hydrogen. They have a lot. So what you're seeing is that red line that we just saw right here. You're seeing it in our neighbor galaxy. So this is the hydrogen line here, out here in the spectrum. And these ones over here are oxygen lines. So we didn't look at oxygen, but oxygen is the third most abundant element in the universe, so you see a lot of it too. Okay, but if we want to understand the history of the universe, which is almost 14 billion years old, we can't just look at galaxies nearby. We can't just look at Andromeda. We have to look back in time. And we do that by looking at galaxies that are further away. And so you see things, at nearby, you're seeing only a little bit back into the history of the universe. Here, this is about, college galaxies. At 10 billion years ago, this is when most galaxies were forming most of their stars. This is what I call a teenage galaxy, going through a growth spurt. Not sure what they're going to do. And then you have these objects that are very red, and I'll tell you why in a second, that are the furthest things that we can see. And these are the infant galaxies that you've probably heard a lot about with Webb. But in addition to looking at things far away to see back in time, we have to contend with something called redshift. So things that are moving, that are further away, are also moving away from us very quickly because of the expansion of space. And so if a nearby galaxy looks like this, if the hydrogen spectrum in, say, Andromeda looks like this, if we look 7 billion years ago, college-age galaxies, it's going to be stretched a little, and those red lines are going to be even redder. And then by the time you're looking at the very early universe, it's stretched so far that you can't even see that red line anymore. It's red-shifted out of what your eye can see. And that's exactly why we needed something like JWST. So if this is our visible light, which is mostly what Hubble looks at, a little bit into the UV, a little bit into the infrared, if we want to look at the earliest galaxies, we have to look at these infrared wavelengths. And this is what JWST was expressly designed to do. We had done a little bit of this with a telescope called Spitzer, but Spitzer was very small, and it was more of a, I would say, pathfinder for the kind of science that we eventually knew that we wanted to do. So in addition to looking at different wavelengths, Webb has a number of other differences with respect to Hubble. So for example, instead of having a mirror that's 2.4 meters across, it has a mirror that is 6.5 meters across. This is a huge increase in collecting area, which means that we can look at things that are even fainter, which is good because the things that are further away from us are a lot fainter than the things nearby. But Webb, I actually have an astronomy magazine from when I was in high school, and I think it has the launch date for Webb like when I was supposed to be in college. And of course, that didn't happen because it only actually launched into space on Christmas 2021. And in my house, I was in Michigan. This was like 6 a.m. But I got up to watch this.
8, 7, 6,
It was launching from French
5,
Guiana. That's why it's
4,
French.
3, 2, unité, top.
And we have engine start. And
Allumage
liftoff.
UAP, décollage.
Decollage, liftoff from a tropical rainforest to the edge of time itself. James Webb begins a voyage back to the birth of the universe.
So watching the launch was a really important moment for me, and I think for a lot of other astronomers, but it wasn't actually the end of the story. We didn't get to use it for another 6 months because it had to travel 1 million miles away to its parking spot at a Lagrange point, what we call L2. It's like a cosmic parking lot. And along the way, it was doing all of these complicated engineering marvels, really. There were so many single-point failures. I think we were all just like waiting on the edge of our seat for 6 months, which was a long time to be anxious. But in the end, everything went perfectly. We have thousands of people to thank for making sure that Webb deployed exactly how it was supposed to, that it entered its orbit perfectly. And in fact, the original target mission lifetime was only 5 years. But thanks to how much fuel they saved on launch and orbital injection, it's actually going to be around for more like 25. So you get to see these kinds of beautiful images for 2 more decades than we thought. Okay, so let's go back to this image, which was one of the, to me, most stunning ways of showcasing the power of Webb. And this was taken with an instrument called NIRCam, creatively named the Near Infrared Camera. But there are actually, so that's here, you can see the sort of footprint of that instrument with respect to a nearby galaxy. But there are 3 other instruments on JWST. So NIRCam is a US-led instrument. NIRSpec, which is the one that I use, I'm going to tell you more about, was led out of Europe. NIRISS was led out of Canada. This is also how JWST guides. It has the fine guidance system, is part of NIRISS. And then MIRI, the mid-infrared instrument, very creatively named also, is also primarily led out of the US. So if we want to see how these contribute to the kind of light that we can see with Webb, this shows you the spectroscopic coverage of NIRCam, the camera that had that image, NIRISS, the one that is from Canada that also lets us guide, NIRSpec, the one I'm going to tell you more about, and MIRI, which is over here doing something that we've never done before. And so I don't actually have, we had to change computers, so I don't have any images. But if you want to see some mirror images afterwards, please come up and I will show you. Okay, so what is NIRSpec doing for us, right? So we've looked at a lot of these images. We've seen this image many, many times. And you can see all of these tiny red galaxies that are very far away. And we want to know what they're made of. We want to use spectroscopy to understand them. And that's what NIRSpec does. It lets us split that light into its colors so that we can look for those hydrogen lines. We can look for those oxygen lines. And that's exactly what you're seeing here. So the hydrogen line that we looked at together is this one. So now you're looking at it in a galaxy 11 billion years ago. And all the way down here, really only a few 100 million years after the Big Bang, you're seeing a different hydrogen line, because that hydrogen line is way gone, and some oxygen lines. So this, when I saw this, I literally gasped. I was with a number of my colleagues at Princeton, and afterwards, as we were walking back to our offices, someone said, "Are you okay?" Because I was just so shell-shocked. I was like walking in a stupor, because this is so incredible. This is so beyond what we have been capable of doing on the ground that I didn't even know how to process it. So let me show you why I was so impressed. So my research is looking at these galaxies 10 to 12 billion years ago when they're going through their growth spurt, because I want to know how some galaxies followed one path and some galaxies followed a different path. And it seems that the time that we need to look at to understand that is when they were growing the most. And so here's one of those galaxies with its sort of phone number name, Q1442 BX172. And this is the best spectrum that we had from the ground. Looks pretty different, huh? So you can see all the same lines. That's the hydrogen line that we looked at together. You can see some from oxygen and nitrogen and sulfur. But this is the best we could do with the largest telescopes on the ground. This is from a telescope in Hawaii called the Keck Telescope, which we also use here at Sierra. And it's 10 meters across. It's a really phenomenal observatory, but it has limitations. And so when they made a call for people wanting to use JWST, my colleagues and I said, me, like everyone else we knew. And we submitted a proposal for a project that we call Cecilia, which stands for Chemical Evolution Constrained Using Ionized Lines in Interstellar Aurorae. And it's named after a woman called Cecilia Payne-Gaposchkin, who was an astronomer at Harvard. And she finished her thesis in the mid-1920s, and it revolutionized the way we thought about the universe. And the reason why is because she was the first to propose that stars were mostly made out of hydrogen and helium, and they didn't share the same composition as terrestrial objects like the Earth. And this was actually very counter to the sort of popular prevailing theories at the time, and she was told in her thesis essentially to hedge her bets, to say, oh, well, I'm probably wrong. And she does. If you go read her thesis, it's quite sad, because her committee convinced her to sort of pull back a little, when in reality, we know that she was 100% correct. So we submitted a proposal as an homage to Cecilia, wanting to look for these emission lines, these lines that we can see with Webb in these galaxies 10 billion years ago. And we requested this in the fall of 2020, which was a time that I think optimism was hard for a lot of people. But in the spring of 2021, we got some very good news that our peers had agreed that we should use that time. And this is actually the image that I sent to my team when we found out, because I think when we sent off the proposal, we just really didn't expect anything. And so it was very exciting. So our team is actually relatively small. It's led by me and a staff scientist at Carnegie Observatories, where Hubble was, named Gwen Rudy. And we're actually very proud that, this program that was inspired by one of the most revolutionary woman astronomers in the early 1900s is being led by two women. But you'll see there's actually a large number of us, and including a relatively large contingent from Northwestern. So this is really where this project is based. All right, so we found out in spring 2021 that we were going to get this. Great. I was living in Carnegie. I was ready. We were all ready. And then it didn't launch. And so I moved across the country. So this is what I was doing while we were waiting for the data. I moved across the country to Princeton. And while I was in Princeton was the launch, but we still didn't get the data. It took 6 months to commission. So I moved out here to Chicago. And it was actually essentially during that move that our data were taken. We found out that they were scheduled sometime in June. And I remember being in my apartment in Princeton, and I just sat down on the couch, and I started crying, like honest to God, just full-on ugly sobs, because I was so, it was like a dream come true. And so I want to show you some of those data now, because they're really incredible. So this is now, the black line is what the spectrum of one of those galaxies looks like. And this gray line is what we had before. That's what I showed you before. So you'll see how much better it is, how much more detail we can use to study these galaxies. So that's that bright hydrogen line that we were looking at together. But if you zoom in, you'll see that there are lines everywhere. And these are the lines that we can use to precisely genetically type this galaxy and compare it with galaxies at the same time and compare it with galaxies today, as well as galaxies in the early universe. And so the next plot is the most sciencey plot in the whole talk. But I think you're ready. We've talked about elements. We've talked about spectroscopy. And so this is a distribution of galaxies in the early universe and the ratio of how much oxygen they have to how much iron they have. And so oxygen is coming from stars that die very quickly. So oxygen is formed very fast. And iron is coming from stars that die more slowly. And so iron is coming on a longer time scale. So things here that don't have a lot of oxygen relative to iron are things that we know grew slowly. Whereas on the other side, these are things that we can tell must have grown quickly. And so by making measurements like this with the data from Cecilia, we are hoping to reveal the most detailed understanding of the ages and formation histories of galaxies at this time than we've ever been able to do before. Okay, the last thing I want to say is astronomers are not done yet. There's still plenty that we want to learn about galaxies in the distant universe. So this is a schematic of our own galaxy, and you'll see that there are a number of different components, right? We have the spiral arms where the sun is, but there's this huge bulge of older stars in the middle. There are these dots of globular clusters. I showed you some in that sort of lens image from JWST. And then there's this sort of diffuse halo of stars as well. And so all of these can have different properties, different signatures, different DNA. But when we're looking at distant galaxies, we're seeing all of it together. It's all mixed together. When in reality, what you want to do is look at all of these individual components separately. And this is going to be possible with the next generation of telescopes on the ground. This is the giant Magellan telescope, which is now being built in Chile. It has a mirror size of 25.4 meters, so 80 feet. This thing is enormous. It has the collecting area, 100 times the collecting area of the Hubble Space Telescope, which means it's sensitive enough to see a candle on the moon. And because of the very large mirror, it also can look at very tiny detail. It has 10 times the resolution of something like Hubble, which means you could observe from Los Angeles, you could resolve a dime in Las Vegas. This is really incredible. And so astronomers are very excited about this next generation of telescopes that should hopefully be coming online at the end of this decade or early next decade. And everyone is looking for ways to get involved with these kinds of projects. Okay, so here we are at the end of the story of me and my team, but also we're not at the end of our story, but we are at a place where we're learning more than ever about the history of our own galaxy and galaxies like it. So what we talked about today is how astronomers use spectroscopy to determine which elements are present in galaxies, and that these elements, this chemical DNA, is teaching us about galaxies' histories and where they fit in with other galaxies in the universe. And JWST, this phenomenal new observatory, is allowing us to push that frontier to earlier times than we've ever been able to study before. So I think the future is bright.
That was awesome. Thank you. I don't know if this is on. My question is, how much of the improvement in spectral quality is due to the instrument improvements of James Webb versus just not being in the atmosphere?
That's a really good question. So you have a huge advantage of giving above the atmosphere, particularly in the near infrared, because the sky is really bright. It's warm, so it's very, very bright. But also what makes JWST so revolutionary is they specifically designed the instruments to have spectroscopic capabilities. So Hubble can do a little bit of this, but actually is mostly an imaging mission. This is the first time that we've built a spectroscopy machine and put it into space. The NIRSpec, the instrument that we used, has 150,000 little shutters, basically, that you can open up in any pattern you want to look at multiple objects at the same time. So it's really made everything much faster than we were able to do before.
Hi. How does it send the images back to Earth?
That's a very good question, and I'm going to tell you, to the best of my knowledge, how I understand this works. So there's something called the Deep Space Network, and everything, actually all of the satellites, so Hubble as well, uses the Deep Space Network to transmit data back to Earth. But this can only be done basically at specific times, and it can only have a certain bandwidth of information. So actually, you have to carefully plan your observations so you don't exceed that bandwidth. And so some of our choices were actually dictated by the fact that we couldn't have a higher data rate. But the Deep Space Network is how that's done.
So the Webb telescope has a, if you will, heat shield, and to go out to the Lagrangian 2 point is to try to get it to close to absolute zero so that it can actually see infrared further away. Is that generally correct?
That is correct. So because we wanted it to be as far away as possible from things that are hot, we moved it much further away from the Earth and Moon than Hubble is. And we have these 5 very thin layers that are about the size of a tennis court, and they're separated by a little bit of space. And so basically the first gets a lot of the heat, and then by the time you're all the way to the telescope on the other side, very cold. And so what happens is that part of the telescope is the only thing that ever faces the Earth and the Moon and the Sun. So it has very specific pointing requirements in order to keep that temperature.
When does the universe end? When does the universe end?
When is the universe going to end? When? Where does it end? Ah, excellent question. One also that the philosophers are debating. But as far as astronomers are concerned, the farthest away that we can see is something called the surface of last scattering, or the cosmic microwave background. And that's basically if you could look so far back that you were seeing the glow left over after the Big Bang. Now, as the universe continues to expand, eventually things will be moving so fast, so quickly away from us that it exceeds the speed of light, and we're going to have essentially a bubble of the observable universe that we see. But there's going to be stuff outside. That doesn't mean the universe has ended. It just means that what we can observe is limited by essentially the light travel time. I can talk more with you afterwards. So I'm not a cosmologist, as it turns out. With these kinds of questions, I never know what the right answer is. Because I think at some level, science is about answering questions where we can look for data that validates or invalidates our hypothesis. And in terms of things before the Big Bang, it's just not observable. So it's hard for science, really, my kind of science at least, to have an opinion on that question. I think that's a philosophical question. One imagines that if there is stuff now, there must have been stuff before, but I'm not sure what the theorists are saying these days. You can't observe it for sure.
I got a question here for you. Is that you said something about growing,
yeah,
like versus oxygen versus iron.
Mm-hmm.
Can you explain to me what does that? Because never heard that term used like that before. What do you mean by growing?
So the elements are not growing. The galaxy is growing. And we are using the relative amounts of those elements to track the growth. And the way that we do that is if you have a very young galaxy, you know that you will only see oxygen because the stars that form iron have not had the opportunity to put that iron back into the galaxy.
Getting big enough to be able to produce that intense level to form iron. Is that sort of correct?
Maybe we can talk more afterwards about your question.
Curious because I look at this and I see some stars that appear to be by themselves and others in galaxies. So is every star associated with a galaxy, or are there stars that are simply in space on their own?
Okay. So when we look at this image, the things that have the 6 points, those are stars in our own Milky Way. They're in the foreground of this image, and the 6 points actually come from the 6 sides of the mirror segments. It's a visual artifact. And everything else in this picture is actually a whole galaxy, so billions of stars. Now, that said, galaxies throughout the 14 billion years of the universe's history have occasionally interacted, and when they interact, they can throw material out. And so it is entirely plausible that there are stars in empty space, but if we can only observe billions of stars together at the same time, we're probably not going to see those.
I have 2 questions.
So if there's many stars in the universe, why is the space between them black?
Well, that's because despite how many galaxies and how many stars are in those galaxies, the universe is just a lot bigger. And so there is really more empty space in the universe than there are stars, even though there are so many stars. It just is the scale of the universe is almost unimaginable. It is hard, actually very hard for me when I sit and think about it to imagine how big it must actually be.
And also, so I learned that the universe is 93 billion light years old, but it only says that the universe existed for 13.7 billion years. So would that mean the acceleration would be growing faster than the speed of light?
So I'm not sure about that. I don't know, where did this 93 billion years come from?
I just found it for how big it.
So you're asking a question, an important question, and if you saw, I made a bit of a mistake earlier in my talk where I was talking about distance and I was talking about time. And the distance to something is not necessarily the light travel time, right? So when something sent light towards us, it was at a particular point, it was a particular distance from us, but by the time that light reaches us, it's further away. And so actually the distance to something now is actually more than the light time it took to get to us. Does that make sense? Okay.
Could you take us through how these projects are structured from the time you write a proposal to collecting the data to analyzing the data?
I think I missed the first part of the question.
The structure of your project, projects, okay? From the time of proposal, collecting data, how is the data collected? Do you collect it? Do other people collect it?
Sure.
How is it structured?
Yeah.
And then the data analyzing.
Yeah, so the way the data are collected is actually pretty different for JWST than it is for telescopes on the ground. So when I use the Keck telescope in Hawaii, I actually am the one controlling the instrument. I sit up all night and I babysit it and I tell it what to do. For JWST, even though it was doing what we said for 40 hours, basically the whole weekend, it was a weekend, I remember, we had to tell them a month in advance what we wanted them to do, because JWST is so elaborate, essentially, that it is controlled and all those programs are executed from a command center in Baltimore. Now, the other part of your question, how do you structure things? Maybe like how do you come up with the idea? Yes. Yep. Yeah. Okay. I see. Okay. So the teams write their proposals, and then they are collected by a central agency. So in this case, it's for JWST, it's the Space Telescope Science Institute in Baltimore, and they assemble panels of your peers who essentially grade those proposals. They're anonymized, so they don't know who they're from. They get graded and then ranked, and then they essentially look at how much time they've requested and cut it off at the time available. And then, as I described the data acquisition process, and then the data reduction and data analysis is often done by the proposing team.
So, if the universe is always expanding, does everything expand with it, or does it stay the same size?
Ah, very good question. So, sure. So if the universe is always expanding, does everything expand with it, or does some stuff sort of stay the same? And I think, are you expanding? So, because it's a really good question, right? Because if the universe is expanding, it's one of the fundamental truths, right? But we look around and we see that we are not changing, the Earth is not changing, the Milky Way is not changing. Andromeda is actually coming towards us and will collide with the Milky Way. And so that kind of defies that picture of the universe expanding. And essentially what's happening is on very large scales, if you looked at the universe from the perspective of a giant, essentially, then you see this expansion. But on small scales, everything is tied together by gravity, and it essentially then has a different relationship to each other than space on the very, very large scales.
Allison again.
Thank all of you.